Good Sunday morning, I'm Jaden Jefferson, and welcome to this week's Community Focus. I've reported on the housing market in the past and how housing prices are going up, but rents for many people are also going up. Coming up on Monday, I'll be talking to the Fair Housing Center about the options you have in terms of getting your rent lowered. But today I'm talking with Paralegal Rashad Daoudi, who's also a law student here at the University of Toledo. He had some tips for renters, especially when it comes to feeling intimidated by asking for help. Take a look.
I would say it's difficult to get your rent lowered. Unfortunately, Toledo is a city where the property owner, the housing provider, has a lot of power. In fact, that's kind of the state of the renting market or housing market in this country in general, that landlords and the people in power tend to have that power, and so they can set the price, and tenants aren't always in a great position to negotiate. Inventory is low. There's not as nearly enough rental housing units available for people. So when you get into that type of situation where there's way more demand than supply, housing is such an important thing. People maybe don't know what their rights are, and I think a lot of times property owners can get away with things that aren't necessarily fair, like high rent and increasing rent. So there are things you can do to lower it or at least have a better experience, but the power, you really have to kind of know how to exert the rights that you do have.
And the situation for a lot of renters is that the place they're renting, oftentimes the owners are out of state, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there are definitely cases where things are neglected and that becomes a struggle. So should people still be paying money even if they're not getting what they expect?
Yeah, definitely. There are things you can do if your property is substandard in any way that can reduce the rent. I'm not giving legal advice. I'm not an attorney, not yet, hopefully about a year from now. But there are things like rent escrow that are available where you can put your money into deposit with the court and force the property owner to make changes to the property to make it, whether it's fixing a leaked roof or flooding or there's mold or no heating or they're just not keeping upkeep on the property. Whatever it is, you can put money in with the court to force those changes to be had. Unfortunately, those rules don't, have to be followed pretty specifically, and you have to assert your rights in specific ways. But you can get people, things like legal aid and other attorneys to help you. You mentioned earlier, though, your question about being able to lower the rent. So the only thing I've seen, I did work in Toledo Municipal Court for a year and a half as a clerk in the eviction and small claims court. So I did see pretty much everything you would ever want to see and not want to see take place in a housing court. But the one thing I did see where people did actually reduce their rent was by doing services for the property owner. Like one particular case where a person was mowing the lawn, or shoveling the driveway, whatever it is, and maybe the property owner would reduce your rent for something like that. However, that's not really a reduction of rent because you are putting in work to make that up. It's not as if all negotiation requires some giving and taking. So if your rent is $500, you might say to the property, well, I'll mow the lawn, every week. So you don't have to come here and do that, lower your rent for $450. But in doing that, right, that's $50 of value that you're giving them. So it's not actually, but you can get potentially, it's very slim times that a property owner will agree to that. They don't want to mix sort of that with the business. But more generally, again, you can assert other rights that can help force a property owner to do things that can at least make your experience living there more beneficial, even if it doesn't mean a reduction of rent.
So in a story I have coming up on Monday, I'm talking with the Fair Housing Center, and obviously their focus tends to be on cases of discrimination and things of that nature. But one thing that was brought up during our conversation was that there are sometimes people are put in tough situations with their landlord where they can be very intimidating. And so when you're faced with something that you want to get addressed at your unit, but you don't know where to start, you don't have that support, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I've seen many people who are economically disadvantaged, who don't know what their rights are, who maybe their intelligence level isn't quite where, because the other side is going to have, an attorney. They're going to be represented. I mean, landlords, 83% of landlords have an attorney, 96%. I recently saw that figure of tenants do not have landlords. So the power structure is very one-sided. So it can be very intimidating if you come to court and you're facing an eviction. But even prior to that, you're right. It can be very intimidating just asserting your right to a landlord that, you want this fixed, right? Because landlords may not listen to you, or, you're afraid to put your rent in escrow, you don't know what's going to happen, then maybe the landlord will now retaliate against you, but there's laws against that. So I think, things that you can do are definitely try to just get legal assistance whenever, if you can. Trying to, work, I think, there's a lot of a concept called movement lawyering, where people, just lay people, band together and find ways to share resources. And if you get even, situations, it's very rare, almost like, a union in a way, like tenants unions or people. And I've seen, tenants get evicted, and I believe based on the pretext that that person was the one who was advocating for other tenants. So when you see something like that happen, it can be very traumatic to the rest of the tenants, because they can feel like, oh, if I speak up or try to, unionize the tenants, I may very well get evicted or retaliated against or treated poorly by. So unfortunately, there is that. It is predatory in many ways, how housing is treated in the city. So we absolutely need a lot of people to get involved, whether becoming attorneys to try to change the legal system or attending events that occur, to just be there to support others, funding things, advocating for funding for Pathways and other organizations that can provide funding to tenants.
Well, that is this week's Community Focus. I'm Jaden Jefferson, and be sure to look out for that story with the Fair Housing Center tomorrow. But for now, have a great Sunday.